Can I ask you to find yourself a place at the table? I'd like to welcome everybody. My name is John Winslade and I'm the President of Phi Beta Delta Gamma Lambda branch here at Cal State San Bernardino. And I'd like to welcome you to our fall luncheon event. Phi Beta Delta, for those that are not very familiar with it, I know that a lot of people here are, but it is a high-profile honour society on this campus, and it focuses our campus community's attention on international scholarship and international education. And I think this is an important function because education is a profoundly important component of international relations, and it does so, it conducts its business at the personal level often, and promises to increase international understanding and thus to bring about a more peaceful world. We hold events like this luncheon event each term at least once, and try to highlight international issues by bringing knowledgeable speakers to campus to help us understand things that are happening in the world. And we have a very interesting speech about that today, which you'll hear more about in a few minutes. First of all, I'd just like to give some special acknowledgement to some very important people who are here. I just want to acknowledge some of those. First of all, the President indicates that he couldn't be here today because he had another engagement, but Tracy Wise is here from the President's office. Could you just stand and say hello? We have some of the deans of our university here. Dr. Tatiana Kamanova from the College of Extended Learning is here. Where's Tatiana? There's here. And we have some past presidents of the Phi Beta Delta branch here. Arturo Concepcion, I saw it's on the list here. Is he here yet? He's on his way, perhaps. Rosalie Giacchino Baker is the founding president of Phi Beta Delta in this university. Peter Robertshaw is also a former president of Phi Beta Delta. And Salam Youssef is also a former president. I see Salam here somewhere. I'd also like to acknowledge Dr. Paula Mayer, who's the Director of the Centre for International Studies and Programs. And his centre has provides a lot of support for the organisation on campus here. Also want to acknowledge, since Rosalie is able to be with us today, I want to acknowledge, to offer you our condolences over the death of your husband, Dr. Fred Baker. I think it's important on an occasion like this that we acknowledge people, and your husband was a firm supporter of our organisation in many ways, and this has been honoured in the formation of a new scholarship which will add to our existing scholarship memorial fund for Elsa Ochoa Fernandez, and I appreciate the contribution that yourself and Fred are making through the setting up of this new scholarship. So thank you, and a special welcome to you for that reason. I mentioned the Elsa Ochoa Fernandez Scholarship, and I also need to make sure that we acknowledge Dr. Lou Fernandez, former provost of this university and husband of Elsa, and his contribution to the organisation has been immense over the years, and the scholarship in honour of Elsa Ochoa Fernandez has been a very important scholarship for this organisation for many years now. A special welcome too to Mr. and Mrs. Yin, who have been loyal supporters of Phi Beta Delta. In 2013, the Yin family donated $10,000 to the Phi Beta Delta headquarters and $3,000 also to the local chapter, which we used to provide scholarships for people last year for international study. This year, they have given us a further donation this time of $30,000, and this is an endowment scholarship, and this is will go to this branch for providing scholarships for students. So I think this is a very generous donation, and we would like to honour and appreciate your generosity here today, and we're happy to welcome you here. Just a little bit of background. Mr. Chin Lung Yin and Mrs. Ming Kwang Yin are friends of Nancy Fu, who's a member of our organisation as well, and is here today. Nancy, just want to say hello. Mr. Yin became a board member of the Inland Chinese Association after they moved to Riverside in 2011. Mr. Yin is the Vice President of the Taiwanese American Chamber of Commerce of Greater Los Angeles, as well as the board member of the Shi-Tai United Foundation. Mr. Yin owns Formosa Rentals and has numerous commercial properties such as hotels and centres, shopping centres and nurseries in Southern California and in Utah. The Shi-Tai United Foundation is a non-profit organisation that combines with the Taiwanese Chamber of Commerce to benefit the region through community, charity, cultural, educational, environmental protection and other social welfare activities. So we appreciate that you include Phi Beta Delta in the list of things which you are involved in and supporting. We appreciate that. I think it's a good time now for us to start our lunch. I'm sure people are ready for that. I think this is a buffet affair where people, tables gradually wend their way around the food at the back there. So I invite people to stand up and go there and get yourself some lunch and sit down and enjoy the lunch here today. And after a little while, when you've been eating for a little while, I'll introduce one or two other people who are going to speak to you, and also our guest speaker for the afternoon. So, first of all, enjoy some lunch. Since there are going to be an increased number of scholarships, we invite you to think about joining and go beyond thinking about it and actually do it. And we'll look forward to inducting you at our winter scholarship dinner, and invite you also to spread the word amongst other students. Since we also have a new scholarship that's honouring study abroad, I'd invite faculty also who are working in areas where they're planning study abroad activity to think about persuading their students who are interested in study abroad to also join Phi Beta Delta. Because this is an important year with a lot happening, with extra funding for scholarships and a conference going on, I think this is a really great year to invite people to join, and we certainly encourage everybody to do so and to spread the word to others around who might well be interested. So I wanted to take a few minutes to just speak to those things, and thank you for your patience. I'll end the advertising here, except for the fact that I want to invite Astrid Shield to come and speak to us about the annual conference. Dr. Shield, as I said, is the National President of Phi Beta Delta. Astrid, could you come and tell us a little bit more about it?
Wait till you hear what I have to say. Actually, I am the President-elect of the National Phi Beta Delta, and I'm a terrible President-elect because I keep forgetting to put this on. Can I borrow this just for a minute?
Yeah, sure.
So I
Look the part.
yeah, there we go. Do I look more presidential now? I was very excited about the fact that we are bringing the international conference here in 2015, because it is also the start of the 50th anniversary of Cal State San Bernardino. And what better way to help us get the year rolling. So it's a great opportunity, an extremely great opportunity for us here, for our students and our faculty to present research papers, to do panels, And because we're in Southern California, one of the things that when we talked about the theme, if you notice, if you look at it, it says, "It's a small world after all." How many of you know where that comes from? I've just ruined your afternoon. You'll never get that out of your head now. But it's a wonderful theme of that we really are. Everything is converging, and you pick up the newspaper and you're going to see things from around the world. So the whole concept of international education in some ways is almost redundant, because it seems like we're merging to the point where education is international. It has to be, because that's the way the world goes. So take a look at this. There's lots of opportunities, wonderful opportunities, and we would really like the folks here at Cal State San Bernardino to shine at this event. This is your chance. This is the International Conference, and it's coming in April. And we'll be putting people up at the Mission Inn, and we'll be doing some things here on campus. Look for more information as it comes along. Thank you. I promise next time I'll remember.
Thank you, Astrid. The next thing I'd like to do is to invite Jeremy Murray to come and introduce our speaker for the afternoon. Jeremy's the secretary of Phi Beta Delta branch here at the Gamma Lambda branch, and he's in the history department at Cal State San Bernardino, and he knows our speaker and is going to speak to us a little bit about what he's going to bring, and we look forward to hearing from him.
Okay, thanks. Thanks all for coming. Thanks to John, Astrid, the Yin family, Rosalie, and everybody for organizing this great event. Thanks also to all the students, all you guys for coming here. And again, I want to second John's suggestion that you join Phi Beta Delta and take advantage of the many opportunities there. It's a great pleasure and an honor for me to briefly introduce Professor Min-Shin Pei. Professor Pei is the Tom and Margot Pritzker 1972 Professor of Government and George R. Roberts Fellow and Director of the Keck Center for International and Strategic Studies at Claremont McKenna College, and a non-resident Senior Fellow of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Prior to joining Claremont McKenna College in 2009, Professor Pei was a Senior Associate and the Director of the China Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington. And prior to that, he was on the faculty at Princeton University from 1992 to 1998. His research, as we'll hear today, focuses on democratization. He focuses on democratization in developing countries, economic reform, and governance in China, as well as U.S.-China relations. Professor Pei received his BA at the Shanghai International Studies University, and we have a Tongxue today. Jim Fenlon also attended this school. And Professor Pei received his MA and his PhD from Harvard University. And when I mentioned to some of my students and they saw the flyer for his talk on my door, a few of my students said, "Oh, I know that guy. Where do I know him?" And I said, "Well, you probably watch CNN, you're probably reading the news, you're probably paying attention to what's going on in China." And they said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, think back, and that's probably where you saw him." Professor Pei is a regular contributor to a number of periodicals, including the China Quarterly, the New York Times, Foreign Policy, China Today, The Diplomat, and Foreign Affairs. And as my students, I think, noted, he's also a frequent commentator, a guest commentator on CNN, and you'll have also heard him on National Public Radio. His books include China's Transition from Harvard University Press, and From Reform to Revolution, The Demise of Communism in China and the Soviet Union, also from Harvard University Press, and a third coming from Harvard University Press. I got the inside scoop this morning. We have more to expect from Professor Pei. Quite simply, I think that Hong Kong today, what's going on in Hong Kong, is one of the most important flashpoints in world politics. The way this has developed over the past couple months and what's going to happen in the weeks and months to come is going to some extent to determine the political course for Beijing, its legitimacy, and how it manages this crisis. And really, I don't think there's anybody better anywhere to tell us about this than Professor Pei. So please join me in welcoming Professor Pei.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. This is a very generous and I hope deserved introduction. I also want to thank the Phi Beta Delta Society for inviting me here today. It's a great personal honor to be here and share with you some of my thoughts on the unfolding drama in Hong Kong. I will first talk about the causes of this conflict and then explain why China has adopted a very hardline position. The reason for this, for the ongoing struggle for democracy, or now we have confrontation in the streets in Hong Kong, is quite complex. But if I have to pinpoint one reason, and that was the 1984 agreement between China and Great Britain. The agreement had two documents. One was its joint declaration. The other, and after joint declaration was issued, Hong Kong drafted its mini constitution, which laid out Hong Kong's political system. The problem with a bilateral agreement between two nations is that if one party breaks it, who is going to enforce it? And 1984, and now we're talking about, oh my gosh, this is 30 years. In the last 30 years, a lot has changed. I would say in 1984, probably Great Britain would have a greater bargaining power vis-a-vis China. But today, China is much stronger than it was 30 years ago. So the problem of enforcing an international agreement to which China committed, that is the heart of this conflict. Then when you look at what promises China has made, because in 1984, China's immediate goal was to effect a smooth transition. And if that could happen, China was willing to promise a lot. But China was also very careful about what it promises. So China managed to promise a lot in rhetoric, but the promises China made were relatively vague. And now, 30 years later, depending on what you look at, depending on the kind of promises you want to look at, different people have different interpretations. And in this particular case, the people in Hong Kong believe that Beijing committed in Hong Kong's mini-constitution to a democratic form of election for producing the city's chief executive. It's like a mayor. The chief executive is very powerful in Hong Kong. Why that's the case, we're not going to go into right now. But Beijing made this promise. This is Article 45 of the Basic Law. And this is verbatim quotation. China says, the Basic Law says, which was passed by the Chinese National People's Congress, that the ultimate aim is the selection of the chief executive by universal suffrage upon nomination by a broadly representative nominating committee in accordance with democratic procedure. I think when they drafted this particular clause, they were not very careful. Because unlike other things like one country, two systems, a high degree of autonomy, this promise actually is quite specific. The only one that where China can get some wiggle room is ultimate. So we do not know what ultimate means. It can be tomorrow, it can be the day after tomorrow. But about, I think, 4 or 5 years ago, Beijing made a promise. We are going to change the way Hong Kong's chief executive was selected. And that raised expectations in Hong Kong. And people in Hong Kong thought they would change from the current system, which is very undemocratic. The current system is there is a nominating committee, there is an election committee, which consists of 1,200 people. These 1,200 people are not elected by Hong Kong people. They are appointed by Beijing. So they are pro-Beijing. And they would elect the candidates, or the candidate. Typically the candidate is presented by Beijing to the executive. So the current candidate, Mr. C.Y. Long, when he ran, he got only 663 votes. So Hong Kong has a population of 7.2 million people. So 600, instead of having half of the Hong Kong voters, or more than half of the Hong Kong eligible voters, to elect their mayor or their chief executive, only 663 people elected. So this is a system that clearly does not meet the description of universal suffrage or democratic procedure or broadly represented. So this is where the origin of the conflict lies. And because of the promise Beijing made a few years ago about changing the system, the Hong Kong people wanted to have a new system that will allow them to directly elect the chief executive in 2017, because the chief executive serves 2 5-year terms. So this is just the political origin of the conflict. Another problem that led to, that contributed to the current conflict is that for the last 17 years after Hong Kong returned to China, Hong Kong returned to China on June 1st, 1997. I happened to be in Hong Kong watching the tournament. Hong Kong had 3 chief executives, and none of them met the satisfaction of the Hong Kong people. The first one was a businessman. When China was about to take over Hong Kong, China's promise was Hong Kong should be governed by a Hong Kongese, someone who is in Hong Kong. But it turns out that the system China put in place allows tycoons, allows businessmen or pro-business people to govern Hong Kong, not someone who is broadly representative of Hong Kong's popular interests. So the first person being picked to run Hong Kong was a shipping tycoon, or his family owns one of the largest shipping companies in Hong Kong. His name is C.H. Tong. He was, his remains, a very loyal supporter of China. His relationship, or his family's relationship with Beijing goes back a long way. According to the press, I think in the 1970s, his family firm was on the verge of bankruptcy. And it was China's help that saved his family shipping firm. So just as an individual, as a family, the Tong family owed Beijing a huge debt. And then even though Mr. Tong himself left, was no longer running his company after he became the chief executive, his family firm called Oriental Shipping had a lot of business dealings with China. It had real estate investments, shipping contracts with China. So clearly there's conflict of interest on that front. This aside, Mr. Tong turned out to be, maybe he was a very good businessman, he was not a good executive, not a good politician, because running a business and running a city are two very different things. I'm probably the only person, well, there are a few people in the US who have done this well. Mayor Rio in LA, I think he did a decent job. Mayor Bloomberg did a decent job. But in the case of Mr. Tong, he didn't do as good a job as he should. And he made a huge mistake. In 2003, he tried to push through a national security law that would undermine Hong Kong's civil liberties. And he became very unpopular. And his his high-handed tactics enraged Hong Kong people, and 500,000 people poured into the streets and demonstrated against him. In a couple of years, he had to resign. He had to retire early before he could finish his second term. So the first leader Beijing picked to run Hong Kong was not successful. And the second leader, he was succeeded by a civil servant, a professional civil servant called Donald Tsang. Donald Tsang was viewed as someone who was quite close to the Hong Kong business community and close to Beijing, but he was not a very strong leader. And toward the end of his career, he became involved in corruption allegations. Hong Kong is a very clean city in terms of its government. It has a very strong anti-corruption agency. But Mr. Tsang himself was found to have taken rides on the private jets of tycoons. This one story about his buying very expensive apartments from real estate developers at huge discounts. All of these things make them look, again, ethically challenged, shall we say. In the meantime, he did not really leave behind a solid record. And the person Beijing initially identified as Mr. Tsang's successor, Henry Tang, a very capable financier, and at the time Hong Kong's chief financial officer. But Beijing did not vet this person very carefully. So the media found, Hong Kong's media, thank God, is very aggressive. So what the media found is that this future CEO, or this chief executive of Hong Kong, broke building codes in Hong Kong. Because Hong Kong has very strict building codes. I wonder how many of you have been to Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a place where land is very scarce, and buildings are on top of each other, so they have to enforce very strict building codes. What Mr. Tang did was not to get the necessary building permit, but he dug a huge basement. He built a gigantic basement behind his residence. According to press reports, Mr. Tang loves red wine. I don't believe it. I like red wine. So he put in a big wine cellar in his house. And the people found out that the future chief executive had violated law, and he did not acknowledge, and he did something really unmanly. He blamed this on his wife. He said, "I don't know anything about this, all my wife's doing." So he was gone. And that led to Beijing, that led to the switch of choice. All along, Beijing wanted Mr. Tang to be the chief executive. And so they now picked this current leader, Mr. Long. Mr. Long became the current leader, I think, 2 years ago. But Mr. Long turned out to be also an ethically challenged chief executive, because it just surfaced that he received $4 million from a foreign company, supposedly to buy out his directorship. He did not own any shares in the company. He was the director of the company, independent director of the company. So it all sounds very fishy about it. So in other words, is that a record of picking chief executive for Hong Kong is not good. They can point to all the 4 past or potential chief executives as ethically, either as politically incompetent or ethically challenged. That's why Hong Kong people want a say in picking who actually runs the city. So this is the second source of the conflict. The third source of the conflict is really Hong Kong has been in decline over the last 70 years. Its economy has done well mostly because of China. The Chinese, because Hong Kong provides a lot of valuable services for China. Financial services, international trade, and tourism. But inside Hong Kong, the Hong Kong government has done very little to improve the livelihoods of Hong Kong people on 2 fronts. One was housing prices. Hong Kong's housing costs are among the most expensive, if not the most expensive in the world. Are you from Hong Kong? Taiwan. Okay. In Hong Kong, I go all the time. In Hong Kong, we are talking about an 800 square foot apartment not in the center, somewhere else, that could cost you $1 million. This is really expensive. But in Hong Kong, so people live in dreadful conditions. Most people in Hong Kong are actually quite poor. They don't own their houses. The Hong Kong economy, despite its ostensible prosperity, it's controlled by a small number of tycoons. If you live and work in Hong Kong, you actually work for the tycoons. No more than 10 families control the bulk of wealth, companies, real estate. Because if your apartment is so expensive, you end up working for a bank, working for the real estate developer that developed the housing complex. So that's why so people in Hong Kong have been very unhappy with the housing crisis. The other is inequality. Hong Kong has one of the highest income inequality in Asia, if not in the world. And inequality for younger generation, they just do not see the future. So that's, again, the performance of the Hong Kong government that, again, makes most Hong Kong people very dissatisfied. And now, let me just talk about the relationship between China and Hong Kong. Because Hong Kong, under British rule, may not, Hong Kong was a colony. Hong Kong did not have control over its own destiny. But in the last 70 years, Hong Kong also had no control over its destiny. So the joke was, Hong Kong replaced, not Hong Kong, just one master replaced another master. You had the British colonialists replaced by communists from Asia. So Hong Kong people did not have a say in their own destiny. But the real clash is in politics, on the political front, relatively recently. I have to say that Beijing, for the most part of the first half of the last 70 years, Beijing was very careful. They tried to stay away. They tried to preserve the fiction that it is one country, two systems. That is, if Hong Kong had its unique system, it is really a very interesting experiment. Hong Kong had its separate legal system, separate currency, separate financial system, and even though it is not democratic, it's far more democratic than China. Its people enjoy all the civil liberties that we would take for granted. But something else happened that nobody thought would happen. That is, closer cultural and economic connections between Hong Kong and mainland China actually drove Hong Kong further away from China. That is, the more they get to know each other, the less they like about each other. And this is something very few people thought about. When initially thought we were just integration, economic, cultural. Economic integration will lead to cultural integration, but the opposite has occurred. Economic integration results in cultural alienation of the two groups, the mainlanders and the Hong Kongese. That is, because the more Hong Kong, the majority of Hong Kong people actually do not know a lot about mainland China. But when they get to know mainland China through Chinese tourists, then they get to like less about mainland China because they find themselves not necessarily superior. They find themselves to be very different from the people from mainland China, because what they found is that mainland Chinese, the mainland Chinese are much less courteous, refined. They just act in a very rude, coarse manner, and they do not show respect for local culture. They spit. They do not obey rules. They loud. All the kind of the worst stereotypes, or not in this case, not stereotypes. The worst images you can have about people they see closely. So they, and that makes them look, that makes them feel very different. So they don't want to be part of that. So the younger generation, in particular, they don't want to be part of China. If this is the future of China, then I don't want to be part of it. And another problem is that Chinese tourists, when they come to Hong Kong, they actually drive up prices. Because there are two kinds of tourists who come to Hong Kong. One would be ordinary Chinese people. They come to Hong Kong, they shop, and they spend their savings. Because they come to Hong Kong, they can buy genuine goods. In China, brand name goods, a lot of them are fake. So they come to Hong Kong, they buy and they shop, and they buy things most Hong Kong people would view as very expensive. And again, it creates cultural divisions, because now effectively they make the Hong Kong people who used to feel economically superior to China all of a sudden inferior, because the things I cannot afford, now they can buy in bulk, line up in front of Gucci and grab everything. So that's just, I think it's a human nature. If we come here, all of a sudden people from a different country, strange country, used to look down upon, they come here, they buy all the nice houses, drive Mercedes-Benz and BMW. I think it's human nature. We will feel very uncomfortable, at least. So that's, and also a lot of Chinese people, quite a few, they try to take advantage of Hong Kong's openness. And two incidents that Hong Kong people got really upset. One was Hong Kong allows permanent residency rights if you're born in Hong Kong. So Chinese, mainland Chinese upper middle class, they know about this. They don't want to have the Chinese citizenship. So they would have pregnant Chinese women would come to Hong Kong as tourists and stay long and give birth. Hong Kong is a very small place. And they take up hospital beds, and that caused huge outcry in Hong Kong because they view, and sometimes they don't even pay the full health care. So that caused another source of division. And finally, I would say, Hong Kong, 7.2 million people, it has to host 40 million Chinese tourists a year. And the country, Hong Kong is drowned in Chinese tourism because the equivalent would be, the US is 300 million. So Hong Kong hosts a tourist population 6 times. So suppose 6 times, we're talking about 1.8 billion people visit the US. How would you feel about 1.8 billion people in one country visiting the US in 1 year? And the US will have to have the Hong Kong population density, which is among the highest in the world. So all this content creates this deepening fissure between China and Hong Kong. So today, if you ask the younger generations, are you Hong Kongese? Are you Chinese? They say, well, I'm Hong Kongese, I'm not Chinese. So this culture, and that explains why most of the people who are struggling or demonstrating today are the younger generation. And then finally, I'll say how Beijing's handling of the Hong Kong situation on the political front has made this confrontation much worse. On the surface, China has one country, two system slogan or motto, but in Beijing's heart, it always wants one country, one system. It's one country, China, one system, Beijing system. It can tolerate for a while one country, two systems, but on the political front, it has to be one country, one party state. And that's very clear. And because China views a democratic Hong Kong as essentially ungovernable. Because how can Beijing govern Hong Kong if the political leaders in Hong Kong have to respond to the voters? So Beijing views this as totally unacceptable. In fact, in the 1950s, according to declassified British Foreign Office documents, China threatened invasion of Hong Kong if British colonialists were intent upon giving Hong Kong democracy. Because in the 1950s, the British government wanted to institute free elections in Hong Kong. And they consulted with China. They said, we're going to do this. What do you think? At the time, Beijing's senior official in charge of Hong Kong said, don't even think about it. We're going to take it over right away. Threatening invasion. So that's, but there's another reason, other than the fact that democracy will most likely make Hong Kong from Beijing's point of view. Democracy in Hong Kong, like democracy in Taiwan, poses a political threat to one-party system inside China. Because the Chinese will say, hey, look, there are other two places that other Chinese live, and they run their own government. They elect their own governments. What about us? So that's another source of Beijing's political concerns. So when the Hong Kong issue floated to the top, to the top of Beijing's political agenda in the last few months, that coincided with a change of leadership in Beijing. The current Chinese leader, the top leader, is politically very conservative. He views his historical mission as preserving the Communist Party's political legitimacy and political monopoly as long as he could. So on the issue of Hong Kong, he sees this more or less from his own assessment of the party's long-term survival. So he has said things publicly that can only come across as very hard line. So that's one, because of the leadership. Another reason why Beijing has been unwilling to make compromise is that the Communist Party seldom makes compromises to people, to four groups or people the party views as weak. Because making compromises, making concessions to weak groups would imply weakness on your part. The Communist Party makes concessions, but it makes concessions to stronger parties, to stronger forces. So in this case, it just goes, making concessions goes against the party's instincts. So as a result, in response to Hong Kong's demands for greater democracy, the Chinese government issued two documents that triggered the confrontation in Hong Kong. One document was a white paper issued in June. I was in June in Hong Kong. It essentially told Hong Kong people to get lost. It was really rudely, it's very clearly worded, but I would say very undiplomatic. It document. It breaks. If you read the document, technically it really breaks the promise of one country, two systems. It essentially says Hong Kong has no autonomy at all because the one country, two system promise is based upon the idea of a high degree of autonomy. The white paper issued by Beijing, which says China is a unitary state. There is no residual power for Hong Kong. So essentially means every piece of power belongs to Beijing, and Hong Kong has no autonomy left. So that, when they came out, it enraged people. And that led to the preparation for confrontations, for demonstrations. And then in early September, Beijing, again, because of the political calendar, Beijing was supposed to release its specific provision, legal provision for electing the next chief executive. So Beijing released this document. Instead of allowing genuinely democratic elections, Beijing said, okay, every eligible voter in 2017 could cast a vote for the chief executive, except the chief executive, candidates for the chief executive had to be approved by the current electoral committee. So Beijing would control the nominating process. Essentially, only candidates approved by Beijing could run in the general election. So you cannot tell Hong Kong that this is democratic. So that led to, immediately triggered the demonstrations. So what about the demonstrations? In fact, Beijing learned that the crisis was coming a long time ago. It's about a year. Occupy Central. Initially, moderate intellectuals, they were talking about occupying the business district in Hong Kong. It's called Central. So Beijing knew that this was coming. But this time, this group, the group that initially began to make the noises about occupying Central, this group did not play the leading role. The movement this time was led by students. Because the students were far more radical than middle-aged college professors. There were three leaders. They're called the three gentlemen. I know one of them quite well. He's a sociology professor, Yale PhD. See, if you send people to Yale, they come back and make trouble for you. Yale PhD, and a really nice guy, Christian. This time, Christianity played very important. Most of the demonstrators are churchgoers, the leaders are churchgoers, and they are supported by the local churches. So students, going back, return to us, younger generation. And the younger generation, they are high school students, college students, and they became the leaders of this movement. This movement at the moment is quite diverse. They are not cohesive. They don't have one organization. By my account, there are 4 separate groups in this pan-pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. One group is professionals led by the Occupy Central. These are middle-aged, moderate people. Then another group, they are democratically elected city legislators. Hong Kong has the chief executive is not democratically elected, but 1/3 of the city's council, they call it legislative council, is elected democratically. So they had 1/3. And these people constitute another group. And then they have 2 more groups. One I would call college students, another group of high school students. High school students, they are led by this 70-year-old young man Joshua Wong, who led a protest 2 years ago against against a move to change Hong Kong's textbooks, and then college students. So right now, the movement itself has problems because they do not have one organization. They have different leaders. They have different goals and different needs. So the current situation is it's a stalemate because the government is not going to make any concessions. The Hong Kong government initially mishandled the incident because it thought it could apply police tactics to disperse the crowds, but instead it got the demonstrators even more angry. So now they're staying there and occupying, I think there are two large places in Hong Kong, one in Central, one in Mong Kok. There's 3 areas. They're not leaving. And Beijing has taken over the crisis management. So Hong Kong, what is going on in Hong Kong is beyond C.Y. Long, the current chief executive's control. Beijing simply tells him what to do. And protesters, for the moment, have run out of options because they have already done what they consider the most radical things, that is to create chaos, not create gridlock in the central part of Hong Kong. So it's a stalemate. So the Hong Kong government is telling protesters, we're in charge, you have to go to Beijing to tell Beijing to change the rules. And the Hong Kong demonstrators cannot go to Beijing unless they want to go to jail right away. Beijing is ignoring these protesters. Beijing, so what is going to happen going forward? Beijing's calculation is this. Because right now China is, in the next 2 weeks, this week actually, China is hosting Obama's visit. So China will not deal with this issue until Obama's visit is over, because it does not look good when you have bloody crackdown in Hong Kong when Obama is in Beijing. So China will wait a while, but I think based on what we've seen in the last months, because the protest has been going on for more than months, Beijing's preferred strategy, outcome, is to allow the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong to die of natural causes. That is, people get tired, and people in Hong Kong, the public gets inconvenienced, because now I heard people from Hong Kong, my son, again, it's a very small place. Now they occupy one of 2 central arteries. So people in Hong Kong will lose patience with them. So it will become very unpopular. So the best thing to happen is that protests would go home, and that's it. Because if you arrest people, you have to prepare to arrest them up. And you have to. And Hong Kong is a very peaceful, very safe area. Hong Kong does not have enough jail cells. I heard that the government, before this all happened, the government built a lot of temporary detention facilities. I think they have to build more, because Hong Kong is really too small to deal with this. So this is Beijing's current strategy. If this is the case, we're going to see this stalemate going on for a long time. Beijing thinks it can afford to wait because it believes Beijing is not, other than having China's image damaged in this incident, Beijing is not suffering. Hong Kong is suffering. Beijing, ideally, Beijing does not want to see this happen, but if this has to happen, it's a cost China is willing to bear. So this is so we're going to see the continuation of the stalemate for some time in Hong Kong. But no matter what happens, I think Hong Kong has been fundamentally changed. Hong Kong cannot go back to business as usual. And Hong Kong will become less governable. Even if the pro-democracy movement dies of natural causes. Let me explain why. In the short term, the chief executive, Mr. Long, he just cannot govern because he's viewed as illegitimate, he is viewed as brutal, he's viewed as corrupt. How can such a leader be effective for the duration of his term? And the second one is that Beijing has lost the face. Because for the first time in Chinese history, the central government is proven to be powerless in dealing with an open rebellion, political rebellion, not armed rebellion, but political rebellion in one of its key cities. Lastly, the people in Hong Kong have been transformed. Hong Kong, before this incident, Hong Kong is known for, the people of Hong Kong are known for their pragmatism. If you, I used to joke that if you fly to Hong Kong, you don't want somebody sitting next to you to be from Hong Kong as well, because other than stocks and real estate, you will have nothing else to talk about. But not anymore for Hong Kong. Now they have something to talk about. They are politically awakened. So this means that governing Hong Kong by the old rule book will no longer work. Beijing has, if Beijing wants to solve its immediate problem, it actually has an easy way out. It can force C.Y. Long, the chief executive, to resign. Easy. And because that will appease the Hong Kong people right away, the crowds will disappear right away. Because today, if you want the students to go home, they say, what have we got? So unless you give them some tangible concessions, they're not going to go home. But I do not believe that C.Y. Long will be fired. Even though the business community this time is very interesting. Beijing wants the business community to come out to support him. Not a single tycoon came out. Because the tycoons are smarter than Beijing. They know their main business is in Hong Kong. If they antagonize the people in Hong Kong, they're going to suffer even more economically. And one key business leader actually came out against C.Y. Long. So his support is weak. But I'm afraid the Chinese Communist Party will not take this easy way out. Because the party has a habit. It would always stand behind its loyal follower. It rewards loyalty no matter what. It does not punish incompetence. Incompetence is not a disqualifying factor. Or you may find this familiar. Loyalty is the most important asset. So the Communist Party is going to be stuck with Mr. Wong. So in the short term, we're seeing an impetus in Hong Kong. But for the medium term before 2017, we're going to see a kind of political stalemate on a larger scale. That is, Hong Kong becoming much more contentious and much less effective in terms of its government. Okay, I'll just stop here, and if you have questions, I'll be very happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Payne. And we do have a little bit of time for a few questions if anyone has anything you would like to ask.
Right, I think it's a very interesting talk. My name is Frank Lin from College of Business and Administration here at Cal State. We presented the reasons, mainly from three different areas: political, social, and economic impact of this equality, I think we see that happens around the world in general, right? And in terms of the globalization or movement of jobs, a lot of jobs actually in Hong Kong has been moved to China, I think, which is one of the main reasons for inequality. And I think that has a very strong implication. That's why it's so complicated in terms of this protest. So my question is, I'd like you to comment more a little bit from the economic side, because I'm from the business school. 1, 2 is the long-term implication for Hong Kong people over there.
Well, I think economics, Hong Kong is a highly developed society, and its lower-end jobs, manufacturing jobs for a long time. Now, even service sector jobs are migrating to China. That's an issue. But I would not say that economic concerns drove the students to the streets. It was secondary. The immediate reason was political, was not economic. I'm personally very worried about the future of Hong Kong as an economy, as I'm worried about the future of the U.S. as an economy because of globalization, because of structural changes in the economy. You have fewer good white-collar jobs throughout the system, the global economic system. And Hong Kong, if you look to 10, 15 years from now, many of the jobs that in Hong Kong will disappear. Because China can do them. Especially when China had its own international financial center. And China can process trade, international trade, directly in China.
We were in Hong Kong just at that transition time and spent about a week visiting schools in the People's Republic right at that moment. And every classroom we went into, there was a diagram on the wall, and the statement was the return to sovereignty, return to sovereignty. And it looked like to the People's Republic and to the sense of Chinese nationalism or self-identity. Hong Kong is China, and that's going to be the way it is. And is that a driving force in the People's Republic? Is that a sense of identity that this is going to have to happen?
Yeah, I wouldn't call this a sense of identity. That is the way Chinese people look at, mainland Chinese people look at Hong Kong, in the way Hong Kong people look at mainland China, are totally in conflict with each other. Because the sense of mainland Chinese, when they look at Hong Kong, it's ours. We have ownership. Because the sense of Schumanism, they call Han Schumanism, because they view this as an outlying area, legitimately ours. Now we have it. It has to do what we say. But people in Hong Kong, when you are accustomed to degree of autonomy, maybe we're different. We should be in control of our own destiny. And so, in a large sense, this is the Han Chinese identity and the Hong Kong identity, and the conflict of the two identities.
You mentioned that the central government is betting on this dying natural process of essentially dying out. But what if it does not? And the demonstrators, they march united to escalate this conflict and take control of government offices and try to claim independence. What are we looking at here when China needs to, since it does not have any options but to respond with force? How is the international community going to respond if we see massacres or things that are escalating? What are your thoughts on that?
First of all, I think the international community is in a very weak position to respond because the Chinese cannot impose sanctions on China since China is so closely connected economically. If you impose sanctions on China, you impose sanctions on the sector. So that's are we prepared not to have iPhones made, because all iPhones are made in China. Just one simple example. Every week there's auction of U.S. Treasury, and the Chinese are big buyers. So how do you deal with it? So that gives China enormous leverage. But China has to be careful about this, because in this case Taiwan is watching. If Hong Kong is handled very poorly, in 2 years Taiwan will have a presidential election, and the pro-independence party will win. So China has to look at that. And that actually is non-trivial for China. So in Hong Kong, I can think about two kinds of escalations. One would be violent escalation. The other would be peaceful escalation. Violent escalation would be students trying to take over government buildings. The current leader has laid down a line. If you try to take over government buildings, I'm going to send in large police force and conduct mass arrest. I don't think students are going to do that. Peaceful escalation is mass hunger strike. Remember Tiananmen? Students, because if they can put the government on the line. Because right now, the students are taking shifts in Occupy. So 8-hour shift, so very organized. They want to make it sustainable. So all of these three places, students we have, again, thanks to smartphones, they know how to organize. They have several thousand people doing the morning shift, noon shift. So it's like going to work. But if this goes on for too long, and they want the government to respond, they can go on hunger strike. Because hunger strike is something that the government will have to respond.
Really?
I've had people fainting in the streets, and you display this insensitivity. Public opinion gets enraged. In Beijing, let's guess in Beijing how did Tiananmen get sustained? For a while, the students were ignored by the government. And the students decided to go on hunger strike on the eve of Gorbachev's visit. So they made public images, the students of Beijing. So if that happens, then that's good. Then I see certain ways that Beijing might say, enough is it. Then Beijing, my scenario is that Beijing would like to create an incident where mass arrest is viewed as legitimate. How do you do this? You organize pro-Beijing supporters to demonstrate against. So you have chaos in the street, because they will go there, trying to take away their, destroy their camps, tents, and they could get in a fight. And once the fight has started, then the police can move in, arrest everybody, right? So that's probably has to end in my head.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Dr. Pei for his presentation today. There are many things that we can learn from a presentation like this. I'd just like to highlight one or two of them. One of them I've learned is that if you're going to be corrupt, don't build a big wine cellar in your backyard. And particularly don't blame your wife. And if you have young people that you're bringing up, don't send them to Yale or they'll come back and make trouble. Some interesting ideas that we got from today's talk. But more importantly, I think we've learned a great deal about a situation in the world which is going to become of increasing significance and importance in the next few years. I was actually in Hong Kong in June at the time when the first demonstration took place on the National Day, I think it was.
Now it's the return, the day of the return.
The day of the...
Thursday of the Communist Party, but also the day Hong Kong was returned to China.
That's right. Yeah. So I witnessed or heard a little bit about the initial feeling that was being generated at that time, and I appreciate the chance to learn a bit more about the complexities and the issues that are constituting the impasse that you're speaking to now. And I guess we will all watch this with greater interest as a result of your talk. So thank you very much, Dr. Pei, for giving us some basic information and allowing us to do that, and for coming here today and giving us something of your knowledge. So thank you very much. That brings our afternoon to a close, and thank you for coming, everybody, and we'll look forward to seeing you at our next event in the winter, and in the meantime, go well. Thank you.